Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation.
So what are we talking about today?
Anything but flooding.
Yeah. For those who don't know, our church is underwater right now. It's the great...
I went kayaking inside of our church yesterday, so I'm hoping that's a once in a life. It was actually pretty cool, but hopefully it was a once in a lifetime experience.
Well, twice in a lifetime.
Well, it's been. I didn't kayak last time. I waded in last time. It was like 2 feet. That was like 7 years ago.
What is it now? Did you say 3.5 feet yesterday?
We had 3.5 feet.
Yeah, I know you said the height was 3.5, but I was looking at the pictures and it was up to the roof.
Those pictures, the angle, because it's taken by like a drone or something.
Well, I actually had a buddy drive down behind the church to put sandbags by the Methodist church the other day, and he took pictures, and it still looked like it was 6 inches from the roof.
The roof line comes down really low, but it was 3.5 feet. Like it came up like yesterday when because you could see it had receded a couple inches by the time we got in there, and so you could see where the line was. And it came up to about the handles of the doors. Okay. Is kind of where it came to. So right at the countertops.
Okay. Well, go on to Mercy Hill's Facebook page if you want to see pictures of Nate and his son and Perry, our other elder, and his wife kayaking through the building.
Yeah, so, fun times.
Interesting.
Fun times. All right, so we're going to move that aside because I need a great distraction, and this was an opportunity for me to be distracted from.
Talk about ancient texts written in the desert instead.
That's right. I want to go back thousands of years right now. Let's do that. Okay.
No water in sight, just desert. All right. So we talked about last time, it was just me where I went over just a bit of, why are we doing this? Why are we talking about the canon? What's the purpose? Why as Christians do we care? And so this time we're going to dive into the Torah and talk about its unique relationship to the prophets. We're going to talk about who wrote it potentially, when did they wrote it, what is the focus of the Torah, and why does that matter for its authorship and its creation. And then we'll talk about, again, just some scribal practices that go into that as well, because we want to get, again, not so technical that we're so long and drawn out and putting everybody to sleep, but we want to do our due diligence and we want to address the issues at hand here, because a lot of Christians don't really know much about them. The only time you usually run into these technical issues is whenever you're running into a Bible debunker who wants to just show you why the Bible is flawed. And those people, they have valid data, but bad methodology for how to handle that data.
Right.
And so we want to handle that data in a proper and academic way, in the way that the actual scholars who are doing the research handle that data, rather than the way your, friendly neighborhood Bible debunker is going to use that information. So the first thing to just, I think, address here is the priority of the Torah, and then we'll get into who wrote it, what's its focus, its internal unity, is it a unified text, and that kind of issue. The first thing I just want to say about its priority is that the Torah as a collection, we can only go so far back and see in its composition history, as far as how we examine the text and knowing when it came about, how exactly it came about. We don't know, obviously, who wrote it exactly. We don't know this person's relationship to God. Did God come down and say, hey, I want you to write a story with these themes and produce the Torah? We don't know how that worked out. We don't know how this person was inspired or commissioned or whatever. Ultimately, I think we derive the authority of the Torah as Christians from the fact that Jesus saw himself as part of this character, the guy that could produce life and come back to life from the dead and defeat death and the devil and all those things. He said, I'm part of that story. And so that's why we care about the Torah and the Old Testament ultimately.
Right. And so, most of our listeners know what the Torah is, but if you're new, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible.
Right.
So
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy.
Yes.
So, that is our Torah. You may hear the word Pentateuch. I'm probably going to use both those words. Pentateuch just means 5 books, referring to those first 5 books. I'm sure a Jewish reader would give a different response, especially as the foundation of their nation and Moses being a central figure, things like that. But the Torah has, from very early on, had authoritative priority over even the rest of the Bible. The Torah, in relation to the rest of the Old Testament, is the one that contains essentially the most authority and the root of everything else after it.
Right. It's the foundation of everything else.
Right. And I mean, if you want to, we'll talk a bit more about what is the central themes of the Torah here in a minute. But I mean, if you've been listening through Genesis, the same themes that we see, especially in our The Meaning of Genesis episode that just came out a couple of weeks ago, go listen to that and you'll hear some of the central themes of Genesis, which those continue right on through the Torah and then on through the prophets, I would say, and then up into the New Testament and so on. And you see this you see this authoritative priority in like books like Ben Sira. There's a reference to the Torah that was in 180 BCE, the Septuagint. So and so the Septuagint, the LXX, there is something to say about that as well, and we'll talk more about the Septuagint later. But typically, the Septuagint was translated 200 to 300 years before Jesus. It is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. So typically, when you hear people say Septuagint, they're talking about the entire Greek Old Testament. But the Septuagint originally was only the Pentateuch, and then there were other Greek translations out there that eventually Christians folded all into the Septuagint.
Okay,
but
interesting.
Technically, when you say the Septuagint, you're referring only to the Greek Pentateuch, the Greek Torah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, it does make sense that the Jewish nation would have looked at the Torah like that was their scripture.
Right.
For many centuries.
Yeah, that was their foundational text.
Yeah.
That the prophets fold into the themes of the Torah.
Right.
I won't say. I will talk about the relationship about the Torah and the prophets in a minute. It isn't significant. But so the Septuagint places priority on the translation of the Pentateuch, and so much so that it was like the rest of the prophets and the other translations came later. Like the original projects just had the Pentateuch in scope. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they group the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, off in its own block as well. So they see it as this kind of unit in some of their writings, the way that they discuss the Torah and the rest of the Bible. Nehemiah 8, you see a reference to the Law of Moses, which is in all likelihood just referring to those original 5 books. And then in the New Testament, we see references to the Law and the Prophets, referring to the whole Old Testament. So there's just the 5 books of the Torah separated off from the rest of the Bible, and you have other references to the Law, the Prophets, and the Psalms as well in the New Testament. So all throughout, really, the text that we have that talk about Torah, the Torah is separated off in its own literary block, and it is a section with the greatest authority and priority in the base of the rest of the Old Testament. So that's just kind of the history and the core of what the Torah is. And so now we need to talk a little bit about its unity. Is it unified? Who wrote it? What themes run through it? And how does it relate to the rest of the Bible? And from there, we will be able to understand a little bit more about how the rest of the Bible came to be solidified after the Torah and how the books were essentially chosen and selected.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in what you're going to say about who wrote it, because I know traditionally most people that I talk to would say, well, it was written by Moses. But you've told me before that that's not necessarily something that's just given.
Yeah, I think that if you hold that, that's fine. But I think you'll have a hard time defending it when you really get into the data. Just because where in the world are we told that Moses wrote it?
Tradition. Primarily.
Pretty much, yeah. There are a couple places in the Torah where God tells Moses to write something down, like, hey, we just battled the Amalekites. Write this down for posterity's sake so that we'll all remember this battle, remember God gave us victory. So we have a couple of notes about Moses actually writing a couple of historical data points down. And then we also have, like I just mentioned in Nehemiah 8, it's called the Law of Moses. And we have in the New Testament, it's also still called the Law of Moses in a couple of places. And so from that, you must assume that Moses is the writer of the Torah, right?
Or at least somebody that was back in that day, a primary figure during that time.
Exactly. Did Harry Potter write Harry Potter?
Right, exactly.
Or he's the main character?
Right, he's the main character. So yeah, Moses could be just the main character.
Right.
Or one of the main characters.
Exactly. And something about this too, I mean, for whatever reason, whether it's because Moses was the main character or because, the first century Jewish audience did assume that Moses wrote the Torah, however that is, just because Jesus called it the Torah of Moses, or just because Nehemiah referred to it as the Law of Moses, does not mean that Moses was the writer. It just means that in that particular setting, they were using the the naming convention of that society.
Right. So it's possible that he could have wrote at least some. Well, we know that he wrote, or he was at least told to write down certain things.
Right.
But we also know that the Torah shares the story of his death and a little bit after. And so Moses probably didn't write that.
Yeah. So I am comfortable saying, like, if you think Moses wrote all of it, that's totally fine. But again, I think the data is not there to support it. It's mostly just a conjectural assumption. I'm fine saying that maybe Moses wrote a couple of paragraphs or something out of the Torah. And that's really it. The rest of it was not done, was done by others. And when you think of writing the Bible, is there, I wonder if you'll remember this, but is there a particular picture that comes to your mind? Maybe a Rembrandt?
Oh, yeah, I can't think of the name of it.
Think of, I don't know the name of it, but you think of Moses sitting there in the dark, puzzling over a letter at a wooden desk in a jail cell. That's the typical picture that we get of Bible writing from the Renaissance.
Right.
And that's not how scribal practices worked at all in the Old or New Testament.
Right.
And so there's a guy named William M. Schneidwind. He has done a really good study. I think it came out actually last year, a book called Who Really Wrote the Bible? And he goes through essentially, starting back with Mesopotamian and just all the data we have about scribes in the ancient Near East. And he shows that really the idea that there were individual authors like we have today writing a book, that's not how things worked. Typically, scribes were a scribal community. They were a scribal guild or a trade, not individuals sitting down to pen an entire work by themselves. Because if you think about it, back then, in a room full of 10 people, in a room full of 100 people, you might have a couple that can write, or a small handful. It was a specialized technical trade, and you worked together, and that was your livelihood, that was your guild, you worked together. And so while it's not impossible that there were individual authors, like, for instance, I wouldn't say that the prophets all wrote down their own sermons necessarily. Like we know Jeremiah, he had Baruch writing his stuff down, but they probably composed their own speeches and things like that. But still, in the when you're writing down stories, whether it's anything from Gilgamesh to the Torah, it was probably written down in these scribal communities as a group effort.
Right.
And they're planning everything out and working all sorts of little games into their work as well. There's all sorts of little scribal word games, number games, things going on. So, and I don't know if that has theological meaning or if it's just for fun in every case. But we all try to find fun in our work.
Now, does that lessen the inspiration at all?
No. Does God have to inspire individuals, or can he inspire
groups?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. It does kind of change my mindset a little bit of like how things were composed, and I've heard this too. Even in the New Testament, like when Paul wrote a letter, he has an amanuensis. He wasn't by himself writing this. He had other people that were helping him craft it and put it together and deliver it, and it was actually a fairly expensive process, is my understanding.
Paper's not as abundant as it is today, or ink and all this. You pay someone who is specialized to write this stuff down and go back and dictate it. And so what you have more often, we'll talk about Paul for a second, because I think that's a good example for us to grasp onto, is it's more so probably Paul's pacing around a room getting his thoughts down, and someone here is jotting it all down, and they craft it into a work later that is a literary completed letter, and even more so in this case with the Torah.
And I think about this. This is not completely unlike like the news or like a newspaper today. You'll have a writer, and then you'll have an editor, and they collaborate and they work together. And sometimes you'll have multiple people working on the same article.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and even on different sermons and things, like we've collaborated on sermons. Whenever I have something to preach, I like to take it to you or talk to Tommy or something like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And shake it out a little bit. And that's what we have going on with these books. And there may have been, let's just use the example of, again, Paul. Maybe Paul is the inspired overseer of this process, if you want to nail it down on an individual. Maybe there's a head of this scribal guild, and he may be overseeing this process, leading everyone, who knows, or maybe they're all working together, but they are all working together to produce a unified work with a particular vision. And I think we'll talk about more. I've made some assumptions in that statement, but we'll talk about those as well. And we may just keep talking and break this episode wherever it makes sense. I don't know, because there's a lot to talk about, and it's hard to find a juncture here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about who wrote it, that probably not just Moses, and specifically talking about the Torah right now. And
we could talk about when.
Okay, let's talk about when.
But maybe we should hold that off after we talk about, I think, the next item I think you were going for. But I just wanted to mention when is probably the next question, but it's not.
Well, do you want to talk about the JEDP?
Let's do that.
Okay, so what's that stand for, first of all?
Okay, this stands for Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and Priestly Writers. There's also the Holiness Code in there as well, so there's now kind of JEDP-H. And this JEDP is kind of fallen out of favor in its original form with scholars. Let me explain what this is first, because I'm getting off on a rabbit trail. So the original theory was that based on the way that the Torah used Yahweh versus Elohim, the word we translate as God, when talking about God, they thought, well, all of the texts that use Yahweh are from a different writer that was spliced together with this text that uses the word God, Elohim, instead. And so basically the original idea was that someone took very different traditions from Israel and Judah and spliced them together, just stapled them together, and made this really weird, half-baked, concocted text that is a mashup of these different Yahwist and Elohist sources, along with the priestly source, which wrote Leviticus or portions of it, and the Deuteronomist, which did the history part, and so
it's basically this idea or this theory that the Torah was put together by multiple different sources, but not like there was no
you ever seen like one of those stereotypical ransom letters that has like a bunch of different copy and pasted letters and words from different newspapers and magazines, so you can't trace the original writer?
So it just
looks like
chaos.
That.
Like it's just a story that if it has any continuity, it's only by chance.
Right. And usually the idea is phrased in the sense that, like, the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, the Priestly, they're all trying to uphold different political agendas, and that's the whole reason that they exist. And then this redactor comes along, usually the Priestly source, and he has a whole new political agenda in the Hasmonean period, and so he just, splices it all together to make his own thing to uphold a new regime. And that's generally the theory. Now, there's different levels of, what is this person's agenda? How much literary artistry did they apply to their editing, or did they just haphazardly do it? You get different flavors of that.
Okay.
Some of the latest work I've seen on this, as far as a full book length look at this, would be David M. Carr's Formation of the Hebrew Bible. And he actually gets rid of the J and E sources and just takes the DP and H, I think, from remembering correctly.
What is the Holiness?
The Holiness Code, they think, is the last few chapters of Leviticus.
Okay.
After the Day of Atonement, you have some more laws about purity and social morality, things like that. And they think that is different from the actual priestly instructions you get at the very beginning of the book, because it's more social stuff, more communal rather than priestly. And so this must be the Holiness Code written by some other author.
Right. But I'm assuming there's another explanation to why it's crafted that way.
Yes.
Okay. But we're probably not going to get into that.
No, we're not going to get into the literary design of Leviticus in particular.
All right. Come on.
Maybe go check out Michael Morales.
There you go. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Who shall ascend the mountain of the Lord? That's a good one for Leviticus. So that's what JEDP is. I think so. JEDP has fallen on hard times, and I'm glad of it. Even thanks to people who do still uphold JEDP, like Robert Alter. He holds a form of it, but he also has been someone who has really spearheaded the idea decades ago, and this has continued since him, that the Torah is literarily unified and is full of narrative artistry that ties it together. Others like Jonathan Grossman is one, and there's also Meyer Sternberg in the Poetics of Biblical Narrative. That is a really good one, where he especially dives deep into what are some of the literary strategies of the Bible. And so he has like a whole chapter on gaps in the biblical text. Like there's gaps in information, and he shows how like that's not because this author just like they forgot information, or they were trying to splice together two sources that just didn't have the information filled in right. He shows like, no, this is actually part of the literary structure to build the tension of the narrative. Maybe there's repetition in a narrative. It's not because the writer's an idiot and forgot and he pasted two different traditions together that had the same information in it.
Right.
It's because he's repeating things for, again, literary flourish, or to remind the reader of something or get it into your brain, or it's part of the tension of the story.
I'm just theorizing right now, but I wonder if some of the JEDP proponents are kind of looking at the Torah through a Western culture a lens of Western culture, and expecting them to write in similar ways that we, or think in similar ways that we do. And
yeah, I think there is I think a lot of it came from the idea that this doesn't make sense as literature as we're used to it.
right,
And so, it must be like the first theory that came up for these influential people was, well, maybe this is from different sources, and that idea stuck and has stayed in scholarship forever. And it has there's been very little actual interpretive fruit from it. It's just a lot of rabbit trails to go down, and so many have come back and shown like, no, all these things that you guys think are discontinuities are actually pretty intrinsically part of the design.
right,
Noah's flood is a big one with all the doublets in there. It's like, this must be two different stories. It's like, well, no, it actually very well, I mean, you can look up scholarship on Noah's flood, the unity and proposed disunity of it. But yeah, the stories make sense as they are. I do like Gary Rinsberg in his book, How the Bible Was Written. He has a whole couple of sections actually on, and he's a Jewish scholar, just dismantling JEDP based on how particular criteria that JEDP scholars have traditionally used to identify different literary sources and segments are actually working towards a unified literary strategy within that narrative unit.
right.
So
right,
you can, there's a lot of scholarship on this.
right.
You could probably look up do some pretty preliminary searches and find good stuff. Umberto Cassuto has also given some lectures. This is pretty old now, but it's really good points to make. He makes a lot of good points that really just show how, again, JEDP, the criteria it uses are not, it's not good methodology.
Right, right. Okay, so to just kind of summarize the different theories that are out there on who wrote the Pentateuch. And so on one side, you've got, it was primarily written by Moses. On the other side, you got the JEDP. But what we're kind of pushing for is kind of a more of a middle ground, that it was written by multiple authors working together. But it's well crafted and inspired.
Or at least, and not to say they didn't have other sources they were dependent on. I mean, we do have even things within the Bible that talk about like, this was actually an excerpt from the book of Jasher and things like that. And they may have other historical annals they're using, but this again was not a sloppy copy and paste. This was all this history and narrative and intention was all woven together into a unified text, to the point that I've appreciated to see even some cautions from JEDP scholars saying that actually we're realizing that this is so unified that it's hard for us to even tell where the sources break, if there are sources.
Interesting.
And so, it's really just trying to identify the sources that make up the Pentateuch, or really just the Bible as a whole, and any book you want to do this exercise on. It's so subjective. You can't really do it. I would honestly love for someone to go through, like I've written a book, go through my book and tell me how many authors there are, because there's no way that I was unified in my tone and in the word choices that I made throughout that book. I mean, I did the editing on that thing, and so I know there's mistakes in it. I've had people point out like, hey, you made a typo here. You weren't consistent in your formatting at this point. It's like, must be another source. Must be another writer in there.
Somebody else wrote that part.
Yeah, exactly. And also there's just so much, like just for instance, I like to point this out, like the Yahwist versus the Elohist idea. Even in text criticism, there are places where the word Elohim replaces Yahweh and vice versa in the Torah in different manuscripts that we have. And so you can't use that as a criteria because we don't even know for sure if that in the original text was Yahweh or Elohim. So again, just there's too many complicated factors. You can't determine the sources.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.